So let's talk a little bit about blood vessels. Blood vessels basically are the roads that your blood is traveling on. So we say that this is the delivery system. It is going to begin at the heart and it's going to end at the heart. If we think back to our drawing, we've got our heart, we've got our right side, we've got our left side. Remember, the left side pumps out to your body. That's going to come back to the right side. The right side pumps out to the lungs. That's going to bring it back to the left side. We're going to do it over and over again. So what we say is that this roadmap, it's beginning at the heart and it's ending at the heart every single time. Okay, so the heart is the pump. Now, I also mentioned to you that there are 3 vessels, different vessels in the body. We have arteries. Remember, arteries carry blood away from the heart. So A for artery, A for away. A great example are the aorta, right? The aorta is the largest artery in the body. It is carrying that nice oxygen-rich blood out of the left ventricle. Now, arteries, as they move away from the heart, they're going to branch so that they can go into different organs and tissues. And as they branch, they get smaller and smaller. And they turn into capillaries. And capillaries are really tiny. They are microscopic. These are the ones that directly serve the cells in your tissues. So capillaries are so tiny, they have such a thin wall that they're allowing oxygen and nutrients to pass into the cells and the tissues. And they're allowing all those wastes, CO2, metabolic waste, to move from the tissue back into the bloodstream. And then veins are going to carry that blood back towards the heart. Veins typically start out really small, especially at the end of that capillary bed, and they're going to merge together. And as they merge together, you get bigger and bigger veins as you approach the heart. So think about like the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava. Those are really big veins that dump right into the heart. Okay, and in order to create those, we've had to merge a bunch of smaller veins together. So here's a great picture. This is showing you kind of the difference under a microscope between an artery and a vein. So let's start over here on the left. Let's start with the artery. So you're going to notice here, I'll draw a circle around the outside of that artery. The first thing I want you to notice is the lumen. The lumen is the inner space that the blood travels through. It's the white area. And you can see the lumen, it's actually what that pointer is pointing on. The lumen is all in here. You can see how small it is. You can also see how thick the wall of the artery is. This is because, remember, when the blood is leaving the heart through an artery, like the aorta is the biggest artery in the body, we have the most pressure, 120 millimeters of mercury, a ton of pressure right there. Arteries typically carry blood under the most pressure. So the wall of that artery, you can see how thick it is in here, is very thick, so it can withstand that pressure. As opposed to veins. Remember, if we go back to this drawing, right, when blood is leaving the left side of the heart, remember, it starts at 120 millimeters of mercury. By the time it gets into the capillaries that are feeding your body tissues, we're down to 35, right? So that's a lot of pressure. By the time it's leaving your capillary beds and going through veins back to the right side of the heart, we're down to 14 and 0. So the pressure is so much lower on the venial side. So if we look over here on the right and we look at this vein, one thing you're going to see is how big this lumen is, the space that the blood travels through. It's really big. The other thing that you're going to notice is that the wall of that vein is really thin. It can be because you don't have a lot of blood pressure. The pressure now in this vein is anywhere from 14 to 0. So you don't need a really thick wall to withstand the blood pressure. So I've been talking about the walls and the thickness of the walls of our vessels. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of a blood vessel wall. There's actually 3 layers that surround that lumen. Again, remember the lumen is the space that the blood's traveling through in the middle. And the 3 layers are, we call them tunicas. So you're going to see that term. The innermost layer, the one that touches the blood, the one that is basically in contact with the lumen, is called the tunica intima. I think that one's easy to remember because I think if it's touching, it's intimate, right? It's right there with the blood, so tunica intima. The next layer is the media, and I just remember M, media for middle. This is actually the bulkiest layer of a blood vessel. And then the last layer on the very outside is the externa. So externa, external, just pretty easy to remember. It's the external layer, the outermost layer. So let's look at these layers just using this image from your textbook. So let's first look at an artery over here on the left, the one in red. And so you can see there's an arrow that's pointing at the lumen. And you can see the tunica intima. And so the tunica intima, remember, it's intimate, it's coming in close contact with the blood and the lumen. It's actually these layers right in here. You do not need to know every one of those layers just yet. The tunica media is the thickest layer, okay? And you can see that the tunica media is all of this area. It's made of a couple of sublayers. And then the tunica externa on the outside is on the way outside. Now let's look at the one on the right, which is a vein. And you'll notice we have the same exact layers, a tunica intima, a tunica media, and a tunica externa, okay? The difference is the tunica media is very different between an artery and a vein. And an artery, again, to withstand pressure, the tunica media, the middle layer, is very thick. So let's walk through each of those tunics and just talk a little bit about them. So we're going to start with the innermost layer, the tunica intima. It is made of endothelium. So remember, epithelial tissue is a covering or a lining. Anytime it lines an open cavity in your body, whether it's the digestive tract or the respiratory tract, or lines the inside of a blood vessel, that is an open cavity. We call it an endothelium because endo means inside. So this is what is lining the lumen of all of your blood vessels. It's actually continuous with the endocardium, which lines the inside of the chambers of your heart. So it lines the atria and the ventricles. And what's so great about the endothelium, this tunica intima, is that it provides a really slick surface. And so this is allowing the blood to move through your vessels without encountering a ton of friction. Now, we talked about in the blood chapter, when we talked about things like blood clotting, I told you that one of the things that's going to trigger a blood clot is that when a vessel tears, you end up with all these collagen fibers that stick up. That's coming from the lining of a blood vessel. So it's going to take the inner lining of that vessel from being nice and smooth to having all these little fibers sticking up, and now it's rough. And that is one of the triggers to cause platelets to latch on right there and seal that wound and create a platelet plug. Now we also have a sub-endothelial layer. Remember, all epithelial tissue has a polarity. So it has a free surface and it has an attached surface. Okay? Where it is attached, it's always going to be attached to connective tissue. We call that the basement membrane. So this should not be new. This should be from Anatomy 1, right? So the sub-endothelial tissue is basically just the basement membrane. It sits under the endothelial lining. And you're going to find this layer anywhere where you have a big vessel. So any vessel that's larger than about 1 millimeter. Teeny tiny vessels are not going to have this basement membrane. Now the next layer, the middle layer, we call the tunica media. This is the thickest layer, and it's made of smooth muscle. The smooth muscle is what is allowing the vessel to either dilate so that you can send more blood somewhere, or it allows the vessel to constrict so you can stop blood flow to an area. So it allows for vasoconstriction and vasodilation, which again, this is really going to influence blood flow. Okay, so a great example might be like when you have eaten a meal, the vessels that are going to your digestive tract are going to dilate and get big because you need to pump some blood in there so you can get nutrients and pull those out of your food. But that also means that vessels going other places are probably going to constrict. They're going to be smaller so that you have more blood going to your GI tract. The other thing that vasoconstriction and vasodilation can influence, other than where we're sending blood in the body, is blood pressure. Okay, I want you to think back to that water balloon example. You have a water balloon filled with water and you squeeze it. What happens to the pressure in that balloon? It goes up, right? You squeeze too hard, it's going to cause the balloon to burst. So in your body, because all of your blood is housed in vessels, when your vessels constrict, what do you think happens to your blood pressure? It goes up, right? Just like squeezing on a water balloon. So vasoconstriction and vasodilation also can really influence your blood pressure. And then the last of our layers is called the tunica externa. This is on the way outside. You're going to have a lot of collagen fibers. Remember, collagen fibers are stronger than steel. So these are really tough fibers. They are there to reinforce and anchor that blood vessel to surrounding structures. You're also going to have nerve fibers and lymphatic vessels running right next to the blood vessel. And then I want to point this out. I'm going to star it because a lot of students forget this term, vasa vasorum. Literally, if we translate vasa vasorum, it means vessel of the vessel. The vasa vasorum is basically a blood vessel that supplies a big blood vessel. How many tissues does something have to be considered an organ? Does anyone remember? How many tissues do you have to have for something to be an organ? How many? Two, right? One tissue is a tissue. Get two tissues together, now you have an organ. Typically, most organs in the body are all four tissues, right? But at least two make an organ. Blood vessels are organs because they have different kinds of tissue in them. We have endothelium on the inside. We have muscle in that middle layer. We have connective tissue in the outside layer. They are organs. Now, if you get a blood vessel that's really big, then you have to supply those tissues with vessels. You have to be able to feed the tissues of a giant blood vessel. And so that's what a vasa vasorum is. We only find it in really large vessels. And it just helps to nourish the outer layer, the tunica externa. So I like this image from your book. This is basically showing you, we've got our heart here, okay? And it's showing you the three types of vessels. Vessels that leave the heart, away from the heart. Remember, those are arteries. And notice that the arteries start out really big. So that would be like the aorta. It starts out really big. And as it moves away from the heart, you can see it's going to branch a whole bunch and get smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually, it's going to feed into capillary beds, which are microscopic. This is how we feed our tissues. From there, we're going to take all the waste that our tissues and cells are creating. It's going to leave the capillary bed through teeny tiny veins. And the veins you can see are actually going to merge together to create a really big vein that's going to dump back into the heart, like the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava, okay? Now, again, I want to talk a little bit about pressure because we just talked about it as we talked about our tunics. So again, the pressure leaving the heart is 120. Think of blood pressure, 120 over 80. So 120, the high number. When we get down to our capillary bed, we're down to about 35. At the other end of the capillary bed, we've lost even more pressure. We're down to 14. By the time we get back to the heart, we're at 0. Okay. So not only is the pressure gradient helping to drive blood flow along with the heart, but it's also going to influence what the walls of those vessels look like. Arteries are thicker. They have a thicker tunica media because there's more pressure. Okay. So this is a table looking at some of the structural differences between arteries and veins. So we've walked through all of these, but now you just have a table of that. So as you're studying, this might come in handy just so you can quickly see what are some differences between